Hello everyone, I am here to show you how to plant seeds on your windowsill. And so I'm going to start by talking about what kind of seeds you could grow and what they might look like when they're ready to harvest. So growing seeds on your windowsill at this time of year is really going to be about growing very small plants that you can then cut and eat, a bit like you might have grown cress when you were a child at school. And so you can grow those kinds of plants. And so I've got some seeds here to show you, but before I do, this is here, I've got some rocket that I planted a couple of weeks ago or so, and this is really what we're talking about, very easily growing on your windowsill, so that this would be ready to harvest essentially, and all you'd need to do is just take some scissors and just cut these just like so, and you've got some what they now call in restaurants microgreens. They sell for huge amounts of money actually, and they're extremely nutritious. The reason why they're nutritious is because all the goodness that's in the seed is now concentrated in those leaves for the plant, and so they are very, very beneficial. As they say, they've got lots and lots of nutrients, so they're great to eat. They're also really tasty. So this is rocket, and the taste of rocket is really going to be focused in these little microgreens. So they kind of provide this really nice burst of taste. You can sprinkle them not only on top of salads, but actually on top of all sorts of dishes. So for example, if you were making a curry, you could sprinkle coriander microgreens that have grown to roughly this size. You could sprinkle those onto your curry for an extra burst of taste, or basil microgreens, that you could then put onto your pasta or pizza or something like that. So this is what we're really talking about, is getting some sort of little plants, mini plants really, because this is just on your windowsill. So that's what I wanted to start by saying. I'll eat those later. And so that's the first thing. So the other kinds of seeds, I've mentioned rocket and basil so far. A great seed, I think, to plant are peas. So these are some pea seeds. You can buy those online. You can also often buy them in shops as well, where they're sold as a food. So that's a really good source of a lot of seeds. Where, for example, if you wanted to buy some coriander seeds, you can buy those in a supermarket, and they'll grow fine. So in other words, seeds that you would normally use for cooking, coriander seeds you'd normally use for cooking, just buy some of those and get planting with those. But these are pea seeds, and they're great because they if you plant these, you'll have pea shoots, which are actually quite expensive to buy in the supermarkets. So they're really great, I think, to grow. And oops, there's one running away. And then here I've got some mustard seeds. They give you a nice spicy, slightly spicy microgreen, which is great. And then you've got lettuce that you could grow. You could grow broccoli, there are lots of different types of mustard and so on. So here's some lettuce seeds, just so you can see those. They're much smaller, you'll notice. So you could grow little micro lettuce. Obviously, what you could also do with any of these is allow them to get a bit bigger. Certainly with lettuce. With pea shoots, if they get a bit bigger, they tend to get a bit chewy, should we say? Get a bit tough. So I usually cut those down quite young. But with coriander, mustard, lettuce, there's lamb's lettuce as well. That's a great one. Cress. If those grow a bit longer, as long as they don't get tough, they're just bigger, basically. So you've got more to put in your salad. So how to get started? Well, today I'm showing you how to use kind of containers that you might well have left over from food that you've bought, plastic containers which you can recycle, which is obviously great. And this one I think had some blueberries in it, and I hope you can see from the camera that it has holes in the bottom. So there's a hole just there. Can you see? Just there. And then I've got one here. This one doesn't have any holes. I think this might have had tomatoes in. I couldn't be sure. So there's a different container. That's going to have some holes in it, but I'll show you that in a minute. This container was grapes, I think, had grapes in. You can see this has got holes in it. So that's a different size container. And then finally I've got this yogurt pot. That obviously doesn't have holes in either, otherwise the yogurt would all fall out. So that would need some holes in there as well. And obviously if you wanted to, you can just use straightforward pots that you would normally put plants in as well. But I thought I'd show you these so that you don't have to go out and buy some kind of specialist equipment or whatever. So what we've got here, I'm going to start with, let me start by just showing you that you do need to put holes in. So here with this container, basically the holes are needed so that you can create drainage, so that the water is not going to collect in the bottom and then will just flood out the seeds. What happens if the seeds get too wet is that they essentially start rotting, which is not a good look. Well, it's not good at all, because then they won't grow, they'll just rot. So you have to be quite careful about making sure that they aren't sort of flooded out and have some good drainage. So I'm just going to take some scissors and just pierce a few holes in here. Obviously be careful when you're doing this that you don't pierce yourself. You shouldn't need lots, it's just so that then there's somewhere for the water to escape. There we go. So now I've got some holes in here, so that should mean that that's fine. You could put in a few more, that would also work. What I'm going to do is to put a piece of kitchen towel, so I just rip that off, at the bottom as well. You don't have to do this, but it partly depends. You see this container here, for instance, because it's got fairly large holes, the minute I put some compost in here, that's going to kind of come out through those holes. And if you're growing these indoors, you don't really want compost everywhere. So I tend to put in a piece of tissue of some sort. You could also just use, I guess, a piece of newspaper or something like that. It's just really to contain the compost inside the container. So having done that, then I've got some compost. Now, there are all kinds of different composts that you can use for this, and probably what I'd say is I wouldn't be too fussed about which compost you're getting. If you look in garden centres, home-based, all sorts of different places that you can buy compost, just really want some multi-purpose compost. You can also use seed compost. So the difference between multi-purpose compost and seed compost is that seed compost has very little fertility in it, so it's not going to feed your plants. And I know that might sound strange, because you sort of think, well, the seeds, surely they need some food to get going, but in actual fact they don't. And the reason for that is because they come with their own little food source. That's why, if you look at some pea seeds, for example, they're quite large, and that most of that seed is in fact food. So it's got its own sort of food source right there. So it doesn't need, seeds don't need a fertile soil. Certainly not when they first get going. So what you'll notice is that the seeds are different sizes. Oops, she says, tipping them everywhere. So these mustard seeds, as you can see, they're much, much smaller. So their food source is much smaller. They've got far less food contained within the seed itself. So so basically, if you're planting seeds, seed compost will be fine. For what we're growing here on our windowsills, the seed compost would be perfect. But multi-purpose compost will also be fine as well. What tends to happen if you're planting seeds with multi-purpose compost is that sometimes they will get a bit what's called leggy. So they start growing very, very long. For what you're wanting, that doesn't particularly matter, I don't think, but it can be an issue. If you were, say, you were planting some tomato seeds that you wanted to put out into the garden, that's not going to work so well in multipurpose. You would be better off, I think, with seed compost. So having got your compost, I've got here, the other thing that you also want with your compost is for it to be free draining, they call it. That's the kind of technical term for basically meaning that when you put water in, the water isn't going to collect in the compost. It's actually going to drain all the way through. And you'll probably notice that if you went out into your garden or you went out into a park and you started looking at the soil, you'd see that there are certain kinds of soil that really don't drain that well, that you'll find that the water sometimes collects on the top of the soil. So that's particularly true of clay soil. So I live in London and the soil here is really clayey, and so you'll often find that the water will collect on top of the soil. That's not ideal for seeds because, as I say, they'll probably just rot, and that's why people tend to buy a compost which they plant their seeds into, because it means that then the seeds aren't so likely to rot. Okay, so here we go. You'll see it's also quite shallow, so this has not got a lot of depth. Okay, you can have containers with more depth. I mean, I'm going to show you how to plant up the yogurt pot in a minute, but this is actually quite shallow. And again, for the way that we're growing the seeds, that's fine, because they're not going to establish a significant root system to just grow as what are known as microgreens, just to grow a very low height, in other words. So they don't need a huge depth of compost. So having done that, we're now ready to put some seeds in, and in here I'm going to plant some peas. Now the issue that you can also consider is how deep do you plant your seeds, and the depth that you plant your seeds is determined by how large they are. So the larger the seed, the more food it has inside the seed, as I've already mentioned. And that food is used by the seedling. Once the seedling is germinated, that food is used for the first two leaves to grow and emerge from the top of the soil. So the more food that you have in a seed, the deeper you can plant the seed, because it will have more food. So it's got more food to last while the shoot's coming up, because obviously the shoot comes up out of the soil, and that means that you can plant it deeper. If you planted these smaller seeds too deep, what would happen is that they wouldn't have enough food necessarily for the shoot to reach the light. So if you remember from maybe you studied biology at school, where basically you would understand that the plants gain their food from the green in their leaves, and they gain their food from sunlight. So sunlight, some air and some water means that they can absorb the carbon dioxide from the air, they get the sunlight and some water, and they can create all their energy from that, which is very useful for us, because that means that's the sort of source actually for all living energy, really. So that's what they need to do. They have to get to a point where they've risen above the ground so that they can reach the sunlight, basically. And I'm just going to show you one of these little microgreens I've got just cut here earlier, because what's really amazing is that when the plant first emerges from the ground, I don't know if you can see this here, I think you can. You see these leaves, this is rocket, by the way. These leaves are a completely different shape to these leaves. So that leaf looks much more like a rocket leaf. You know, if you buy some rocket in the supermarket in a bag, that leaf looks much more like a rocket leaf. And then these two leaves here, those were the first leaves to emerge. You can see that they're right at the bottom of the, let me just see if I can position this so that you can see that, right at the bottom of the shoot. So they came out first, and as soon as they came out, they could start basically photosynthesizing. They could start generating food for the rest of the plant, so that then the other leaves can start to grow and start to emerge. And so that's quite important to understand, that these two leaves didn't have emerged without any photosynthesis, without any energy coming from the sun. So these two leaves were entirely dependent on, in fact, rocket seeds look very similar to these, because they also come from the same family, so from these mustard seeds. So they're very similar size. So these rocket seeds, the rocket seeds were basically dependent on the food they had in the seed to push up the first two leaves that emerged. And I'm just going to take a moment because I can see that some people have joined us. So hello to Belinda and Sheila and Dawn from Harts Hill and Pam from Newcastle and Shirley. It's good to see you. And if you've got any questions, just type them in as I'm going along. You can tell that I'm just yakking away here, telling you all about how to plant some seeds on a windowsill, but I can see any comments or questions, so if you have any, then please just put them in and I'll be very happy to answer them. So just a quick catch up. We have got to a point that we've established that we're going to get a container, and as I've said, I'm just recycling some containers from the kitchen here. I've put in some kitchen towel or tissue at the bottom, and that's really just because there are holes in this and I don't want the compost just coming straight out of the holes and making a big mess, making enough of a mess as it is already. So but I find that's quite helpful because you're growing indoors, so that you don't just have compost leaking out. And then I've just put in some compost, and I was just talking about the difference between multipurpose and seed compost, and for this you can use any compost that you can find. The main issue is not to use heavy kind of clay-like soil that you might get from the outside. That's not going to be ideal. For a lot of these seeds probably be fine, but you actually want it to be reasonably free draining, as they say. So that's why this compost is, you can see it has a texture. I'll just put some in my hands so that you can see it a bit more clearly. It has a texture which is quite fibrous, shall we say. So certainly much more fibrous than you would find in the soil, and so it's ideal for seeds. So as I was saying, how deep you plant your seeds is dependent on the size of the seeds. So these peas are quite large. This container, if I was looking to grow peas that I was then going to plant out in the garden, I would use a much deeper container than this, but I'm not. I'm looking to plant some pea shoots, grow some pea shoots, and these will grow fine in here. So what I'm going to do, this is quite hard to show on the camera because it's all so dark, but I'm hoping, I've just created a kind of trough here, and it should become clearer once I put the peas in. So I'm putting them in, I'm sowing these really quite thickly, and that's because I want a goodly amount of microgreens, and they'll all grow. So I'm hoping you can see I've just created a kind of line of peas there, and so yeah, there you go. And Shirley Ann's just asked, I bought some microveg and herb sprouts in the summer. They were delicious and high in nutrients. Can I harvest seeds grown in the same way? Absolutely you can. So I was just showing everyone that these are some rocket seeds that I grew recently. I've just harvested those while they're really small, and they couldn't be easier to grow, to be honest. Rocket, pea shoots, mustard, lettuce, coriander. Coriander's really nice. Basil, celery, all sorts of seeds. Pretty much whatever you want to grow, to be honest. So you can see I've created a line of peas here. What I'm going to do is cover those up, and very close to that I'm going to just use my fingers to create another kind of trough and do another line of peas. There we go. So I'm hoping you can see that. So I've just moved along a bit and put in another line of peas. I'm going to cover those up now, and create another trough for some more peas. Pop those in. There we go. And then I'll just get a little bit more compost, cover those up. And then I think I can fit another row just right down the end. So you can see I'm planting these really thickly. There's no way, if I was planning on planting these up to grow in my garden, there's no way I'd be planting them this thickly. This is just so that they'll grow thickly and provide me with a large number of what are known as microgreens. Well, that's what we call them now, at any rate. Okay, there we go. So that's now, those are planted. Now, the one thing I would say about peas is that you can see they're very dry, and you can also see they're quite large as well. So one of the things that you can do before you plant them is to soak them in water for about 6 hours or so. Now, I say 6 hours. But what I don't want to have happen is for you to kind of put them into water at 10 o'clock at night and then feel that you've got to set your alarm for 4 o'clock in the morning to take them out. It's around about 6 hours. Okay, so putting them in water overnight will be just fine. And really it's just so that that kickstarts the germination process, because it just gives them a chance to soak up the water, and that will get them started with being germinated. Now, having said that, you obviously do not have to do that. I've just planted these without soaking them first, and they should be fine. So, but what I am going to do is, remember, I've still got holes in this, so even though I've put in the tissue, the water will still come out. So I've just got a plate to put it onto. So you will need something like a plate or some kind of container, and then I'm just going to water it. And what you want to do when you're watering, people tend to, if you haven't done this before, of course you become kind of, oh my goodness me, have I put enough water, too much water, how much water does it need? And that's definitely something that you'll get more of a sense of as you gain in experience. So what you can see is I've just put in quite a lot of water. This is really quite wet now. It's extremely wet actually. And the peas are starting to emerge a bit. So what I'm going to do is put a bit more compost on top, because that always happens. Whenever you put water onto your compost after you've planted, the compost, all the air is kind of knocked out of the compost pretty effectively. And what I would do now is just leave that to drain, but I don't want it to sit in the water. I don't know if you can see that, but there's water that's collected on the plate now. So what I want to have happen is I want it to stay damp, but I don't want it to remain sitting in its own water, in the water, because that's what will mean the seed will rot. So I'm going to just tip that into the compost, and then I'd leave that to drain some more, and then drain that water off as well. And the water is really the key part to successfully growing microgreens, because you've got generally you've got a small container. If it's indoors, it might, and it's next to a window, it's probably going to be close to a radiator, and so it means it dries out really quickly. And so that's the main sort of tender loving care that's going to be needed for these seeds, is to make sure that they stay well watered. And ideally you want the soil to be wet like a wrung out sponge. Okay, so you don't want it sopping really, so that's why I'm saying, you can see there's more water coming out here now. It's still draining, which is great, that's fine. I do want it to start with a goodly amount of water. I want to make sure that the water's reached right the way through the compost, and that the seeds have got nice and wet, but I don't want them sitting in water. So you'll probably find that you'll have to water them sort of morning and evening. What you can do as well is, I've just done it with a jug. I've just watered with a jug. What's ideal for microgreens is to use a sprayer, the kind of thing you might use for the iron, that sprays water much more gently. That works really well, but you do have to make sure that the water penetrates. So the biggest mistake people make, I think, is that they see the top of the compost is wet, but they don't realise that the water hasn't actually penetrated right the way down, all the way down the compost to the roots. And if the roots dry out, then your plants will die. And to be honest, you can also see, I mean, once they start growing, if they haven't got enough water, they'll just start keeling over and looking really sad, basically. And so then you quickly give them some water and they'll probably come back to life and be fine. So it's just about watching them, really, and making sure that they are going to be okay. And they're sort of wet enough. Now this little container here, I would say probably on a windowsill, maybe 10 days, and you'll be able to harvest your pea shoots. What you've got to bear in mind is that there's not so much light now. We're into the winter months, and for most plants, if you give them these plants anyway that I'm talking about, they'll be fine with the amount of warmth, so that's not going to be an issue. But they do like to have light, and so they grow more slowly in winter when there's not so much light around. So, but if you put these just on a plate like this, making sure that there's no water sitting underneath it, pop that on your windowsill or a shelf or something that's by your window. At any rate, it will need to get a goodly amount of light. So if you've got a south-facing, west-facing window, that would be ideal. And then it's great fun, because then each day you can have a look and see what's happened and see whether or not the seeds have started to come up. And with pea shoots, you're really waiting until they get about that tall. You'll see, and you'll probably recognise them if you've ever eaten them from the supermarket. And then you literally just get some scissors and cut them, as I was showing you earlier with the rockets that I had growing here. You just literally snip and remove the microgreens. So that's with pea shoots, and that's with that container. And then what I'll do is just move that over there, and I'm just going to show you to plant some mustard seeds. I think I'll plant some mustard and cress, actually. I quite fancy some of that. So I'm just going to show you with some slightly different seeds. So once again, this was a grape. This had grapes in, so it already has some holes. So I don't need to add any more. I think it's got 1, 2, 3, 4 there. Quite large holes once again, so that's why I'm putting in the tissue. I'm just going to fill that up with compost. And again, because this is a nice see-through tray, I don't have to fill the whole thing up with compost. I'm just going to put in that much, because plenty of light will get through the plastic, so that's fine. So here I've got some mustard seeds, and with these are, I'm not going to try and plant each seed individually as I did with the peas. I'm just going to sprinkle these on top, and what I hope you can see is that I'm also planting these fairly thickly. So that's some mustard, and then I've also got here some cress. There. So you can very easily buy these seeds in the supermarket, but garden centres are also open at the moment, so you can also quite easily get seeds from there. And so I'm now going to sprinkle, it's just like sprinkling salt on food, really. Sprinkle, sprinkle, sprinkle. Lots of cress, love cress, and mustard. There we go. Maybe even a few more. So these seeds are much smaller than the pea seeds, as I was saying earlier. And so what it means is that I'm not going to cover them with as much compost. So what I'm going to do now is, having put those in, I'm just going to take a little bit of compost here and sprinkle it on top. I do want them to be covered, but not with lots of compost. I mean, to be honest, when you're growing them like this, they'll actually be fine without being covered, but it's better, they prefer to be covered up as seeds. There's something that I hadn't realised until relatively recently, that seeds are actually alive. I mean, I sort of had realised, but not fully registered, that they are living, because they look very dried up and sort of desiccated. You really kind of think, really? They're alive? But they have a tiny little hole. I don't think I'll be able to, there's no way I'll be able to show you this on the film, but they do, and they breathe. And so they are alive but waiting to change, a bit like a caterpillar, you know, when it goes into a chrysalis and then becomes a butterfly. The seeds, to me, are a bit like that. They are going to change form, but they do get to a point where they die. And so that's worth bearing in mind. You know, if you've got some seeds that you've had you know, knocking around for the last 10 years, and you plant them, they may well not germinate. They may well already have died or be dead. And so just bear that in mind. You know, getting the fresh seeds they have a better chance of germinating, I would say. So having done that, that's all set up now. And I'm just going to water these again. The advantage of having a sprayer, by the way, as well, rather than this rather clunky jug that I've got here, is that what you'll find is, I don't know if you can see that, but there are some seeds that have just become unearthed by the force of the water. So again, I'm just going to sprinkle over a bit more compost just to make sure they're covered. Don't want them to be too covered, but just to make sure they're covered. And as I did before, I'm just waiting for that water to drain through, and just then tip that water off. Now, the key thing that I forgot to mention, which I am really bad at doing, I always think that I'm going to remember what it is I've planted, and that's just not true. So I generally, for a label, I often use these lollipop sticks because they're wooden. I think you can also, though, cut up a milk bottle into a kind of strip, and that will also work as a label. I mean, I'm sure that you could come up with all sorts of other ways of labelling. But I do find it's useful, because then especially if you're planting a few different seeds, because then you'll actually remember what they are. If I'm using one of these, however, I find that if I use pen, the name disappears very quickly. So I'm going to use one of these and just write in pencil, if I just planted mustard and cress. There we go. And then usually what you do is just pop the label just down the side like that, and that way you're not going to be wondering, well, if you're anything like me at any rate, wondering which you'd planted in which container. So I'll just move that over there now, and I'm just going to do a label for my pea shoots. Now, the other thing you'll also notice, no doubt, is that I've now made a right mess. So probably worth bearing in mind that if you're doing this indoors, pea shoots, I'll just pop that down the side there. If you're doing this indoors, I would really recommend getting a tray, or, I mean, this surface that I'm working on is fine, I can just wipe it down, but in all likelihood you're going to get compost about the place, so just bear that in mind. Obviously, if you've got an outdoor area, that's even better, you know, you can do it outdoors. So I've got about 10 minutes left. I just wondered if anybody's got any questions that they'd like to ask. And I'm not sure that anybody has, so what I might do is just go on this container's got very small holes, so I think what I shall do here is plant up some lamb's lettuce. So because it's got small holes, I'm not so fussed about putting in a tissue, because the compost isn't going to come out so easily. So there we go. This is another thing you can do, is just tap it on the surface. That just helps knock the air out of the compost, which is useful. And what I've got here is some lamb's lettuce, which again, you pay quite a lot in the supermarket to buy lamb's lettuce, so definitely worth growing your own, I think. What I love as well is the fact that the seeds are also different. Look at those. Completely different colour, different size. Amazing. So I'm just going to sprinkle those on here. And again, as you can see, I'm planting them fairly thickly. You can sprinkle directly from the seed packet, but what I tend to find is that I suddenly have upended the seed packet more than I thought, and then the next thing I know, I've just got all the seeds when I don't necessarily want them. So I tend to do it into my hand first and then just sprinkle them about the place. It's still a little bit random, but a little bit slightly more controlled. So there's my lamb's lettuce seeds. Again, looking at the size of these, you'll see that they're quite small, so they're not going to be that large. They therefore you don't want to cover them with too much soil, or compost I should say. So I'm just putting a little bit of compost on here, cover them up. There we go. Bring back my plate, pop them on top, and then I can just water them through, just gently give them some water. Whoops. There we go. Just making sure that the water's gone right the way round, covered the entire surface. And I'm imagining you can just see glints of where the seeds have emerged. Again, as I said before, so I'm just going to cover those up with a little bit more compost, and then again you can see there's quite a lot of water come out of this one. I think you can probably see that there, so I'm just going to tip that into the compost. It's still draining through, which is great, so I'll just leave that there for a moment while I write my label. And that is lamb's lettuce, also known as corn salad. There we go. My label, pop that down the side. And this one should also take probably a week to 10 days to emerge and be ready to eat. So the one thing that you will notice from this is that I've now got probably enough for, I can add these to a salad. And I think there are two final things that I'd say before finishing. The first is that I've now planted 4 different types of leaves. That's lamb's lettuce, pea shoots, and mustard and cress. So that's 4 different types of microgreens that I should have emerging ready to eat in about 10 days or so. What I think is really great about this is that it means that I can really add to the diversity of green leaves that I'm eating, and scientists are now understanding that that's a major factor in maintaining your health and the health of your gut. So it's really beneficial to have a selection of different green leaves that you're eating. So that's all great. The other thing I'd also say, though, is that what's very useful is to set yourself a timetable. So what you could do is plant some microgreens every couple of days or so, maybe just one tray every couple of days, and you'll find that then you'll have what's known as successional microgreens, which basically means that you'll have some pretty much every day ready to grow. Now obviously that partly depends on how much windowsill space you have. You know, it's not everybody that kind of has a space in their living room or wherever, or their kitchen put aside for your kind of microgreens farm. But it's just something to bear in mind, that you could actually grow quite a lot of, well, I say quite a lot, you could grow some really nice tasty greens for your salads just on your windowsill. And the main thing to think about is the fact that if they're going to take 10 days or so, just to spread out how you're planting them. And so I would do that. And secondly, I would also say, or finally, really, I would also say that what's great to do is just to experiment. So try different, you know, different vegetables, different things, different microgreens to grow. You know, so there are lots of other things that you could also, heaps of oriental vegetables, as they call them, which are basically vegetables that are grown in the autumn, but they make excellent microgreens. So things like mitsuna, mibuna, lots of different mustards, pak choy, tatsoi, obviously the rocket. There are, you know, lots of different herbs that you could try, like basil, and celery. Celery is a really nice one. Coriander's delicious. So I think I will just conclude this by saying good luck and have fun, and hopefully you'll really enjoy growing your microgreens. And I've got a couple of minutes left just to check if anybody's got any final questions. And since it looks like there's not, I'm hoping that that has been useful. Oh, there's a whole load that I've missed. Sorry. I've just realised that there are some questions. Do they have to be kept very warm, or would a summer house be okay? Summer house should be fine. They might be a bit slower to germinate. And then, great. Okay, well, I'm glad. It looks like that's it on the questions front. And I'm hoping that you've found this useful. And look forward possibly to seeing you for another session. I'm sorry you can't see my face, by the way, but I haven't, I thought that it was most important for you to be able to see what I'm doing with my hands. So it's been a lovely session, lovely to have you all here, and thank you very much for coming, and hopefully see you in the future. All right, bye.